The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. A sleepy summary. A sleepy telling of a lonely girl, a hidden door, and the slow, beautiful magic of growing things. Once upon a time, in a land very far away across a wide gray ocean, there was a little girl named Mary Lennox. She was not a pretty child, and she was not a particularly kind child, and she was not, if we are being truthful, a very pleasant child at all. She had a thin yellow face and a thin yellow body and thin yellow hair, and she had lived her entire short life in India, in a hot and hazy place full of color and noise and servants who did everything she asked without question. Mary had grown up without ever being told no, without ever being asked to do anything for herself, without ever really having to think of anyone other than Mary. Her mother was a beautiful, frivolous woman who had no time for her daughter and found the child disagreeable, and her father was a busy man who was always ill or always working, and who paid even less attention to Mary than her mother did. So Mary grew up spoiled in the strangest possible way, not spoiled with love and attention and warmth, but spoiled the way a fruit spoils when it is left sitting alone for too long. She was, in the beginning of our story, a sour and selfish little girl, and she did not know it because no one had ever bothered to tell her. Then one morning, something terrible happened. A sickness came sweeping through the part of India where Mary lived, a dreadful cholera that took people away in the night like a quiet and terrible tide. The servants fell ill. The neighbors fell ill. And then Mary's parents fell ill too. And before the sun had set on several dreadful days, Mary found herself completely alone in the big silent bungalow, with nobody to look after her and nobody, apparently, to care. She had hidden in the nursery, and the whole house had gone still around her, and she had waited and still nobody came. When the English soldiers finally came to collect the survivors, they found Mary sitting alone in an empty house, playing by herself, and one of them said, in a hushed and wondering voice, that nobody had even remembered the child was there. Mary herself did not cry when she heard this. She did not cry at the funeral. She did not cry at all. She had never been taught how to cry for anything that was not her own immediate comfort, and the loss of parents she had barely known felt to her like a kind of distant and puzzling strangeness rather than a grief. She was packed up and sent to England. England was a word that had meant very little to Mary until now, and it still meant very little as she sat on the great rocking ship that carried her across the dark, heaving ocean. She had no friends. The woman assigned to care for her on the voyage found her sullen and unpleasant company. Mary sat by herself and looked out at the gray water and thought about nothing very much. When the shores of England finally appeared through the sea mist, gray and low and quiet, Mary looked at them without any particular feeling at all. She was taken to the home of her guardian, a man named Archibald Craven, who was her mother's brother-in-law. Mr. Craven did not come to meet her at the station. A housekeeper named Mrs. Medlock came instead, a large woman with hard red cheeks and sharp black eyes, who looked Mary up and down with a kind of brisk disapproval, and seemed no more charmed by her than Mary was charmed by Mrs. Medlock. They sat together in a railway carriage, and Mrs. Medlock told Mary, in a voice that suggested she did not expect the information to be received well, that she was being taken to a place called Misselthwaite Manor in Yorkshire, and that she was to live there now. Mary looked out the window at the dark English countryside rushing past in the rain and said nothing. Mrs. Medlock, finding that Mary was not going to be a rewarding conversational partner, told her about Misselthwaite Manor anyway, partly because she liked to talk, and partly because the silence was uncomfortable even for a woman of her constitution. She said it was a very great old house, more than 600 years old, with nearly 100 rooms in it, though most of them were shut and locked. She said Mr. Craven was a strange man who had been a recluse since his wife had died 10 years ago, and that he was sometimes kind and sometimes not, and that when he was in one of his dark moods, it was best not to speak to him at all. She said the house sat on the edge of a great wild moor that stretched out in all directions, flat and desolate and windswept, and that the wind came off the moor in winter like something alive and bitter. She told Mary all of this in a straightforward way that seemed to have no notion that it might be frightening information to give to a 10-year-old child who had just lost her parents and been sent to a foreign country. Mary did not find it frightening. She found it simply a new collection of facts about a new collection of circumstances that had been arranged around her without her consent. It was late at night when they arrived at Misselthwaite Manor. Mary pressed her face to the carriage window and could see almost nothing, only the great dark shape of the house against the even darker sky, and the lights in a few windows, and a vastness of flat emptiness all around that she understood must be the moor. She was taken inside through a side entrance, up staircases and along corridors so long they seemed to go on forever, past doors that were all closed, past tapestries and dark portraits and fireplaces cold with old ash, until she was brought to a small, comfortable room that was to be hers. Mrs. Medlock told her that she must keep to her own rooms and the garden, and that she must not go wandering about the house looking into rooms that had nothing to do with her, and that she must not make noise, and that Mr. Craven did not wish to see her. Then Mrs. Medlock left, and a young servant girl named Martha came in with a supper tray, and Mary sat in front of the fire and ate very little and went to bed and lay in the strange, quiet dark, and listened to something she could not quite identify, a distant, constant, whispering roar. It was the wind on the moor, but Mary did not know that yet. Martha was a round, rosy Yorkshire girl who talked a very great deal, and seemed entirely unbothered by Mary's silence and ill temper. In fact, Martha seemed to find Mary's sulkiness more puzzling than offensive, and she chattered away while she lit the fire and made the bed and brought the breakfast tray, talking about her own enormous family, her mother, her 12 brothers and sisters, and above all her youngest brother Dickon, who was apparently a magical sort of boy who could speak to animals and make anything grow. Mary listened without appearing to listen. She was not used to being talked at by servants and found it deeply peculiar. In India, servants had been nearly invisible, there when needed and gone when not, always deferential, never familiar. Martha was startlingly, bafflingly familiar. She seemed to have no idea that she was supposed to treat Mary as something separate and superior. She treated Mary like a person. It was most disconcerting. Martha told her that there was a garden in the grounds that no one had been allowed to enter for 10 years. Mr. Craven's wife had loved it dearly, had tended it herself, and when she died, he had locked the door and buried the key, and now the garden sat sealed and silent behind its high wall, with no one to care for it and no one to know what was happening inside. Something about this piece of information caught in Mary's mind and would not let go. A garden that was locked, a door that was hidden, a key that was buried. She found, for the first time since she had come to England, that she was interested in something. She went outside that morning to explore the grounds. The moor was vast and brown and swept by a cold wind that smelled of something wild and alive, a smell that was very different from India, sharp and fresh and clean. Mary walked along the paths in the walled kitchen garden and past the flower garden and along the walls of other gardens. She found that there was one wall she kept coming back to, a long ivy-covered wall with no door in it that she could see. All the other gardens had doors. This one, as far as she could tell, had none. She walked alongside it slowly, running her fingers along the old brick, and looked up at the bare trees on the other side, whose branches were just visible above the wall's edge, and she thought about the locked garden and the buried key. There was an old gardener who worked in the grounds, a bent and weathered man named Ben Weatherstaff, who was gruff and unsociable, and who, for some reason Mary could not quite explain, she liked a great deal. He was the first person she had met, she realized with a strange clarity, who reminded her of herself. He had no great warmth for company either. He dug his beds and trimmed his hedges and spoke to no one unless spoken to, and when Mary spoke to him, he answered in short, reluctant sentences that contained more sense than most people's long ones. He had a robin who had attached himself to him years ago, a round, bright-eyed little bird who followed Ben about the garden with proprietary familiarity. One morning, the robin flew down near Mary and cocked his head and looked at her, and Mary felt something odd move in her chest, something she could not name, something that might have been the very first stirring of a feeling she had never had before. The robin looked at her as though he found her genuinely interesting. It was a very new sensation. The robin led her to the key. It was not magical exactly, though it felt very much like magic. The bird was digging and scratching in a flower bed near the ivy wall, and Mary was watching him, and she saw something glinting in the freshly turned earth. She bent down and pulled it free and found it was an old key, dark with rust and age, clearly very old indeed. She stood and held it in her hand and looked at it for a long time. She did not know for certain that it was the key to the locked garden. But she knew it in the way that children sometimes know things, not with the mind, but with something underneath the mind, a deeper and more reliable sort of knowing. She put the key carefully in her pocket and went inside, and the key lay against her leg all through supper and all through the evening. And when she went to bed, she held it in her closed hand and thought about the garden that no one had entered in 10 years. Then the robin showed her the door. It was only a few days later, a morning when the wind had died down, and something that was almost like spring warmth was in the air, though it was still very early for spring. The robin was in the ivy, and Mary was watching him, and a gust of wind came and moved the ivy on the wall in a way she had not seen it move before. And there, beneath the curtain of leaves, she saw the round iron handle of a door. She ran forward and pushed the ivy aside with both hands and found the door, old and wooden and set into the wall, and she took the key from her pocket and put it in the lock and turned it, and the door swung slowly, rustily, creakingly open. She stepped through and pulled the door shut behind her and stood quite still in the secret garden. It was winter still, and the garden was bare and gray and tangled. The rose canes arched and twisted over the walls and up into the old fruit trees that stood here and there in the silence. The grass was brown and overgrown. Dead leaves lay drifted against the bases of the walls. And yet there was something about it, something in the gray, quiet air, something in the very tangle and desolation of it, that made Mary feel as though she had entered a place that was not quite part of the ordinary world. It was private and enclosed and still in a way that nothing else in her life had ever been still. It was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers before. She walked slowly along the paths, stepping over the old dead growth, and she looked at the rose canes and tried to see if there was any life in them. She scratched at the bark with her fingernail and found a line of green beneath, pale and tender. They were not dead. Things were alive in here. They were just sleeping. She went back to the garden every day. She went secretly, slipping through the door when no one was about, and she stayed for as long as she could, and she began to clear away the dead growth from around the small gray-green shoots she found pushing up through the soil. She had never gardened before. She had no idea what she was doing, but she found that she wanted to do it with an urgency that surprised her, a wanting she had never felt for anything that was not simply the gratification of her own immediate desires. This was different. This was wanting something to live. She cleared and dug and pulled, and the cold air made her cheeks pink and her breath come out in small white puffs. And she was, though she would not have been able to say so, happy. And then she met Dickon. Martha had told her so much about this boy, her youngest brother who could charm animals and make things grow, that Mary had built up a picture of him as something almost mythological. She was not entirely wrong. She found him one morning in the secret garden, which she had told him about, in a moment of trust she had not planned, and which she immediately regretted and then immediately did not regret. He was a rough, red-cheeked boy of about 12, with a wide smile and a cap pushed back on his curly hair, and he sat on the grass surrounded by animals, a crow on his shoulder and a fox cub at his feet and squirrels in the trees above his head, and he was playing a rough pipe and they were all listening. He looked up when Mary came in and smiled at her the way she imagined people smiled at each other when they were genuinely glad to see them, without any guile or performance or expectation. Mary had never received a smile like that in her life. It hit her somewhere deep and unguarded, and she had to look away. Dickon knew about plants. He knew about every plant in the garden, walked along the paths and named the roses, said which canes were dead and which were merely sleeping, told her what the bulbs pushing up in the corners would become, saw things in the gray ground that Mary could not see, and explained them to her in patient Yorkshire phrases that were full of warm, practical knowledge. He was not showing off his knowledge. He was sharing it the way you share something you love, simply because loving it makes you want others to love it too. Mary watched him and listened, and she began to understand that there was a way of being in the world that she had not previously encountered, a way of caring, a way of being connected to growing things and to other people, and to the life that moved in cold soil and bare branches. And she found, very slowly and with great uncertainty, that she wanted to learn how. But there was something else at Misselthwaite Manor, something else that Mary had been told to ignore. At night, sometimes, she heard crying. Not the wind, though she had told herself it was the wind, though Mrs. Medlock had told her firmly it was the wind. It was not the wind. It was a child crying, somewhere deeper in the great dark house, and one night Mary could not sleep and could not stop listening. And she got up and lit a candle and went out into the corridor and followed the sound through the dark, winding passages, past the locked doors and the cold fireplaces and the faded tapestries, until she came to a door that was not quite shut and pushed it open and went inside. There was a boy lying in a great bed in a room full of firelight and shadows. He had a thin, pale face and enormous dark eyes and a look of such concentrated, self-absorbed misery that Mary almost recognized it, because it was something not entirely unlike her own face. He stared at her and she stared at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His name was Colin Craven. He was Mr. Craven's son, and he was 10 years old, and he had been in this room for most of his life. He had been told, or had told himself, or had somehow come to believe that he was an invalid, that his back was going to grow a hump the way his father's had, that he was going to die before he grew up. He had been coddled and isolated, and allowed to be as tyrannical and unreasonable as the sickest, most indulged of children, and the servants obeyed his every whim and kept him in his rooms and avoided anything that might upset him. And he lay in his great bed and read books and thought about his own death and made everyone around him miserable, and no one, apparently, had ever thought that any of this was wrong, or that it might be doing the boy more harm than good. Mary was not impressed. That was perhaps the most important thing. She was not gentle with him or hushed and worried around him. She did not tiptoe or soften. She told him with the bluntness of someone who had been blunt herself for years that she thought his manner was disagreeable, and this astonished him so completely that he did not know what to say. No one had ever said anything like that to him. He had been treated as too fragile for honesty. Mary had been treated as too unimportant for honesty. They had both been failed by the adults around them in slightly different ways, and they recognized each other, and it was not a comfortable recognition, but it was real. Mary went to Colin's room several more times. She told him about the moor. She told him about the way the wind smelled and the way the spring was coming and the way the birds were beginning to come back. She told him about Dickon and his animals. And she told him about the garden. Not the locked garden, not at first. She was not quite ready for that. She talked around it, talked about the grounds, talked about the ways things were beginning to grow in the cold soil, and Colin listened with a hunger that she recognized because she had felt it herself, that hunger for something real and alive when you have been shut up too long in small rooms with only your own thoughts for company. She told him about the garden eventually. She described it to him in the quiet, firelit evenings when the rest of the house was still, described the rose canes and the old fruit trees, and the way the light came in at a certain hour of the afternoon and lay across the brown grass in long, warm bars. She could see him listening. She could see him wanting. Colin, who had spent his whole life wanting things he could not have and not wanting things he could, began to want the garden with the same single-minded intensity that Mary had learned to want it herself. He said he wanted to go outside. This was a remarkable thing for him to say. The servants were afraid of it. They feared that the fresh air would be bad for him, that the exertion would hurt him, that if anything happened to him, Mr. Craven would hold them responsible. But Colin, when he made up his mind, was not an easy person to resist, and one morning in early spring he was carried out into the garden in his wheelchair, and Dickon and Mary walked alongside him, and they took him along the path through the walled garden and through the door in the ivy and into the secret garden. And when Colin saw it, he made a sound very small and very brief and then was silent for a long time. It was spring. The garden was alive. The roses were coming out in pale, tender pink and ivory along the old canes, and the bulbs had pushed up through the earth in drifts of color, yellow and white and deep, rich purple, and the old trees were clouded with new leaves of the most brilliant and delicate green Mary had ever seen in her life. The birds were everywhere, filling the enclosed air with song. The light lay warm and golden across all of it, and Colin sat in his wheelchair in the middle of it and looked and looked and looked. Something began to change in Colin after that first day in the garden. It began very slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way the garden itself had changed, the way all growing things change, not all at once, but inch by inch, day by day, too slowly to watch, but undeniably and irrevocably happening. He began to come to the garden every day, at first in the wheelchair, and then on his own unsteady legs, leaning on the arms of Dickon or Mary, and then standing alone in the warm spring air and breathing it in with a concentrated, deliberate attention, as though breathing were something new and wonderful to him, which in a sense it was. He began to eat. He had always been a poor eater, picking at his food with the perverse obstinacy of a child who has found that refusing food is one way to control the world around him. Now he was hungry. He asked for more at mealtimes and looked annoyed when the portions were too small. The servants observed this development with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. They had built their whole professional relationship with him around his fragility, and the fragility was beginning, quietly and steadily, to dissolve. Dickon taught them both about gardening. He taught them how to plant and how to weed and how to tell the difference between a weed and a seedling, and how to water and how to prune, and he taught them the names of things in both botanical Latin and plain Yorkshire, and he taught them how to look at growing things and read what they needed from the color of the leaves and the set of the stems. He taught them with the same patient and generous attention he gave his animals, without condescension, without impatience, with a real and uncomplicated delight in the sharing of what he knew. Mary thought sometimes that Dickon was the most remarkable person she had ever met, partly because he appeared to have no idea that he was remarkable at all. Colin began to develop a philosophy. It was a child's philosophy, built from fragments of things he had read and things he felt and things he had observed in the garden, but it was genuine and it was his own. He called it magic, and he meant by it the force that made things grow, the force that had brought the garden back to life after 10 years of abandonment, the force that he could feel working in him when he stood in the garden and breathed the spring air and felt the sun on his face. He said that magic was in everything, in the soil and the seeds and the light, and that if you believed in it and worked with it rather than against it, it would work in you too. Mary was not entirely convinced by the philosophy, but she found she could not quite dismiss it either, because she looked at Colin, who 6 months ago had been a pale, trembling boy who thought he was dying, and she saw him standing straight and tall in the garden with the sun on his face. And whatever had made that happen, magic or time or fresh air or work, or simply the accumulated daily fact of being alive in a living place, it was real and it was good. Mr. Archibald Craven was far away. He had been traveling for years, wandering through Europe and beyond with the restlessness of a man who cannot be still and cannot be quiet because being still and being quiet would mean having to sit with his grief. His wife had died 10 years ago. She had fallen from a tree branch in the secret garden she had loved, and the fall had damaged her, and Colin had been born early and fragile, and she had never recovered, and she had died. Mr. Craven had loved his wife with all the love a man who was not naturally easy with people could possess, which was a great deal, and her loss had broken something in him that he had not been able to mend. He had shut up the garden and locked the door and buried the key and gone away, and he had stayed away, and he had let everything at Misselthwaite Manor manage itself as best it could while he roamed the world with his grief tucked under his arm like a wound he would not let heal. He was in Austria, in a valley full of flowers beside a lake, when something strange happened. He was sitting by the water in the soft evening light, feeling as he usually felt, which was empty and tired, and without any particular reason to continue being where he was, when he had a sudden vivid sense of peace that seemed to come from outside himself rather than from within. It was not quite a sound, and it was not quite a feeling. It was something between those things, a sense of being called from a great distance. a sense of something he had thought was gone that was in fact still there. He thought of his wife. He thought of her saying to him, in the voice he had not heard for 10 years, "Come back." He sat by the lake and the light faded and the stars came out and he sat there a long time. And the next morning he wrote a letter to Mrs. Medlock asking for news of the manor, and then he began, after a long pause, to go home. He got a letter from Colin as he was traveling home, the first letter Colin had ever sent him. It was a brief letter, stiff with the formal language of a child who has been told all his life that his father is a remote and difficult man, but there was something in it that made Mr. Craven read it more than once. Colin said that he was well. He said that he was getting stronger. He said, in a sentence that he had perhaps written 3 or 4 times before he settled on the words, that he hoped his father might come home. Mr. Craven folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket, and felt it sitting there against his chest as the train carried him northward through the green English countryside. The summer deepened. The secret garden went on growing and blooming and filling with color. The roses came out in waves, one variety and then another, pale pink and deep red and creamy white and soft, warm yellow, and the scent of them lay over the garden in the warm afternoons like something thick and dreamlike. The lilies came up tall and white and trembling in the slightest breeze. The old apple trees were hung with small green fruit. The grass was a living carpet of flowers, clover and wild thyme and little daisies, and the bees worked steadily through it all morning long in a contented and purposeful drone. Mary and Colin and Dickon worked and talked and sat in the grass in the warm midday, and ate the food Dickon's mother sent, plain Yorkshire food that tasted better outdoors than anything Mary had ever eaten at a proper table. And they were, in the full and unremarkable sense of the word, happy. Mary thought sometimes, in the quiet evenings, about the person she had been when she arrived at Misselthwaite Manor. The thin yellow girl who had never been interested in anything, who had never loved anything, who had looked at the world with the flat, disengaged stare of someone who expects nothing and wants nothing, and has no idea that there is another way to be. She could not quite connect that girl to herself. She was in the same body. She was still Mary Lennox, but she was not the same at all. She was brown from the sun and her arms were strong from digging, and she slept hard at night and woke ready for the day. And she had friends, real friends, the first she had ever had. And she cared about things passionately and without embarrassment, the garden and the robin and Dickens, Crow and Collins slowly straightening back. And she did not know entirely how it had happened except that it had happened here, in this place, in this garden, in the soil and the air and the light of an English spring coming back to life. Colin grew straighter. This was a fact and an observable one. Dickon noticed it first with his careful gardener's eye for the way living things change, and he said nothing to Colin about it, only smiled to himself in the way he smiled at something growing well. Mary noticed it next. Colin's spine, which had been curved with the long habit of lying down, was lengthening and squaring as he stood and walked and worked in the garden each day, and the hump that he had feared so terribly for so long was not developing, and had perhaps never been going to develop, had perhaps been nothing more than the rounded shoulders of a boy who had been lying in bed his whole life. He was not going to die. He was not an invalid. He was 10 years old and he was healthy and strong, and he was growing in the sun like everything else in the garden, putting out new growth daily, reaching toward the light with a will that surprised even him. He was in the garden, running. This was the most remarkable fact of all, and it happened on an afternoon in late summer when the shadows were long and golden, and the garden was at its ripest and most abundant. He had been walking faster and faster for weeks, his legs growing stronger beneath him with every day of outdoor work. And on this particular afternoon, something simply clicked into place, and he was running, stumbling at first, and then with increasing confidence, his arms out and his face turned up to the warm sky, running in the enclosed green world of the garden with something so like joy that it was indistinguishable from it. Mary ran with him, laughing, which was a thing Mary Lennox had not done much of in her life, and Dickon leaned against the wall and watched them with the satisfied expression of a gardener watching something he planted come into full bloom. It was at this moment, at this precise and golden moment, that the door in the wall opened and a man came through it. He was a tall man, slightly bent, with a tired and beautiful face that showed signs of having once been quite fine before grief had drawn long lines across it. He stopped in the doorway and stared at the scene before him, at the blooming and brilliant garden, at the laughing girl, at the boy running toward him, straight and tall and strong and brown with summer sun, the boy he had left as a pale invalid and had not known how to love, the boy who was in fact his son. Colin pulled up short when he saw him, and the two of them stood looking at each other, the father and the son, with the whole blossoming garden behind Colin and the shadow of the door behind the father, and the light between them thick and golden and full of floating seeds and petals. And then Colin said, in a voice that was absolutely clear and absolutely certain, "Father." Mr. Craven came forward slowly. He was trembling slightly, the way a man trembles when he is very moved and is not quite sure yet whether what he is seeing is real. He put both hands on his son's shoulders and looked at him, at the straight back and the clear brown face and the strong arms, and his face, which had been set in grief for 10 years, was doing something unfamiliar and difficult. He said Colin's name. Colin looked up at him with the direct gaze of a child who has, over a summer, learned what it is to be alive, and he said, "I'm well, father. I'm really well." And Mr. Craven, who had not wept since his wife died, who had shut himself against weeping as he had shut himself against everything that might hurt him further, felt something give way in him like a gate opening, and he held his son, this son he had feared and avoided and not known how to be near. And he held him for a long time in the middle of the secret garden, while the bees worked in the flowers, and the birds called in the old trees, and the golden afternoon lay over everything warm and unhurried and very still. Later, when the first rush of feeling had quieted, Colin told his father about the garden. He told him how Mary had found the key and found the door. He told him about Dickon and the growing things and the magic he believed was in everything. He told him about learning to walk and learning to run and learning to eat and learning to sleep with the window open and the more air coming in cold and clean across the bed. He told him all of it carefully and precisely, the way a person tells the story of something important to make sure it is properly understood. And Mr. Craven listened with his eyes on his son's face and heard not just the words but the boy underneath the words, the boy who had become himself in this garden over a single long summer, the boy who was in fact extraordinary and who would go on to do extraordinary things, who was at this moment simply 10 years old and healthy and alive, and standing in the autumn light of a garden that had been locked for 10 years and was now, clearly and irrevocably, open. Mr. Craven walked through the garden with his son and the two children, and he looked at the roses fading now toward autumn, and the apples reddening in the old trees, and the late flowers still brave and bright in the borders, and he thought about his wife, who had loved this garden more than anywhere else in the world. He thought that she would have been glad. He thought that she had perhaps been watching over it in some way that he could not entirely account for but did not entirely disbelieve in. The way Colin did not entirely disbelieve in magic. Because the garden had come back to life after 10 years of abandonment, and the child had come back to life after 10 years of being buried alive in a sick room. And both of these things were facts, and both of them defied simple explanation. And they had happened here, in this place, behind this old wall. In the secret that had been growing all summer while he wandered the world with his grief. He made a decision, standing there in the autumn garden with the evening light going long and amber across the old walls. He decided to stay. He had been going away for 10 years, going away from Misselthwaite and away from Yorkshire, and away from everything that reminded him of his wife and his loss, and it had not helped him. The going away had only made everything smaller, had shrunk him down to just his grief and the road ahead, and he had walked that road for 10 years and found it went nowhere. The garden had stayed. The manor had stayed. His son had stayed, though he had been left alone in a sick room to manage as best he could with no one to teach him how to be alive. Mr. Craven looked at his son's face and was ashamed, quietly and without drama, the way a good person is ashamed when they understand clearly and too late something they should have understood long ago. And then he decided to stay, and to try, and to begin. The autumn came in softly, the way English autumn comes in Yorkshire, not all at once but gradually, the days shortening and the light going golden and then amber and then low, the moor changing from brown to bronze, the garden pulling its energies back underground for the winter. The roses were cut back and the beds were mulched and the bulbs were planted for another spring. Mary and Dickon and Colin worked in the garden as the weather allowed, and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and there was a quality to those autumn days that Mary would remember all her life, a quality of fullness and richness, the sense of a summer completed rather than merely ended. Ben Weatherstaff, the old gardener, was told at last about the secret garden. He had known about it all along, of course. He had been climbing over the wall for years, in defiance of Mr. Craven's orders, because he could not bear to see Mrs. Craven's roses die. He had kept the roses alive through 10 years of cold and neglect, climbing the old wall on his creaking legs when no one was watching, carrying water and cutting back the worst of the dead wood, doing what he could with what he had, loving the garden in the only way available to him. When Mary had first come into the garden and found the roses scratched at and partially tended, she had thought it was the magic. In a way it had been. It had been Ben Weatherstaff's particular brand of magic, the stubborn, unglamorous magic of a gardener who turns up and does the work whether anyone is watching or not. He did not say anything very sentimental when the children told him. He looked at the garden and looked at Colin, whom he had not seen properly since Colin was a very small baby, and he said in a rough and not quite steady voice that he was glad. That was all. He was glad. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve in a brisk and businesslike way, and then he told Dickon that the north bed needed more bone meal, and Dickon said he would see to it, and Ben Weatherstaff nodded and went back to work, and that was the end of it, and it was exactly right. Mary had her own private reckoning, though she would not have called it that. She sat sometimes in the garden in the quiet autumn afternoons when the others had gone in, sitting on the old stone bench near the roses, and she thought about her life before she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She thought about the bungalow in India and the hot days and the invisible servants and her mother's beautiful, indifferent face. She thought about being found alone in the empty house and not being missed. She thought about the long gray ocean crossing and arriving at a gray country where nobody was waiting for her, and nobody seemed entirely sure what to do with her. She thought about the girl she had been, the thin, yellow, sour girl who had nothing and wanted nothing and expected nothing and had never had a reason to be any different. She felt a tenderness for that girl, a complicated and gentle tenderness, the way you feel for someone who suffered without knowing it, who was lonely without knowing it, who needed things she had never been given and did not know how to ask for because no one had ever shown her that asking was possible. Something had been given to her here. Not love, or not exactly, or not yet, though there were the beginnings of love in the friendships she had made and the place she had come to inhabit. What had been given to her was something more fundamental than love. It was the knowledge that she was alive, that she was capable of caring, that the world outside herself was real and interesting and worth paying attention to. It was the knowledge that a neglected garden, given half a chance, would come back. She held this knowledge the way she had once held the old iron key, in a closed hand, pressed to her chest, sure of it. The story does not end with a great flourish or a dramatic conclusion. It ends as most real things end, or rather, it does not quite end at all, because the most important things in it, the growing and the changing and the coming alive, are not the kinds of things that end. The garden would keep growing. Colin would keep growing. Mary would keep growing, though she was a different kind of plant now, one that needed sun and air and real soil and the company of other living things, and had found, to her lasting astonishment, that all of these things were available to her. Mr. Craven would stay, and he would learn to be a father, and it would be clumsy at first and sometimes difficult, because 10 years of absence cannot be undone in an afternoon, but he would try, which was the thing he had stopped doing, and trying is where everything good begins. Dickon would go on being Dickon, which was a very great thing to be, and his animals would follow him across the moor in the early mornings, and his mother would leave fresh food on the doorstep of the secret garden, and know without being told that the children inside were well and safe and fed. The robin would have a nest in the rose canes in the spring, and Ben Weatherstaff would pretend not to care about the eggs and would check on them every morning without telling anyone. The bulbs planted in the autumn would come up in the spring, all the ones that Mary and Colin and Dickon had pressed into the cold, dark earth with their own hands, and they would bloom one morning in February or early March when the light was still thin, and the moor was still brown, and the whole world outside the garden walls seemed cold and bare, and not yet ready for anything. And the flowers would be there behind the wall, quiet and certain, not asking to be noticed, not waiting to be discovered. Simply being the thing that they had been all along, growing in the dark, alive in the secret, opening toward the light. This is the end of the story of the secret garden, and also the beginning of it, as all endings of stories are also beginnings, and as all locked doors, opened at the right moment with the right key, lead somewhere you could not have imagined standing on the outside of the wall. The garden waited for 10 years in the cold and the dark, and it did not die. The children were left alone and untended like seeds in dry soil, and they did not die. The father carried his grief across the whole length of Europe and could not put it down until the voice in a valley called him home, and he came home, and the home was there, and the door in the wall was open, and inside everything was growing. It is a story about what happens when the door is finally opened and the winter finally ends, and the answer, of course, is spring. It is always, eventually, inevitably, with patience and with love, and with the simple daily work of keeping things alive, spring.